I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast, Rob. Today, we are looking at a fairly short Ouyang Xiu poem.
You know, weeks after we said we were done doing Song Dynasty poets, we're going back to the Song Dynasty poets.
It's so good. It's so delicious. So good. You can't not have seconds.
And you can't, or thirds, or fifths, or tenths. I got to throw this in there, too. You know, I think the standard approach to studying classical Chinese poetry pretty much has you living in the Tong. You might get a poem or two in the Song, but my experience is that everyone wants to focus on the Tong. That's when this quote-unquote great stuff was written. And I love the Song. The Song is just kind of all over the map. You have bits and pieces of poems that read like the Tong, and then you have stuff that feels almost like free verse. It's all over the place.
You know, the reason that the Song is so underappreciated is actually because of the Song itself. The Song dynasty thinkers, they were the ones who kind of came up with this idea that the Tong should be worshipped, that the Tong is better than anything else anybody has ever done or could possibly do. And the only thing you can do as a good Song poet is to try and pretend like you're in the Tong. That's all coming from the Song dynasty. I think that the Tong thinkers would have found that super weird.
I think they would have. And it's interesting because I think most future scholars just sort of follow along from the Song going, yep, Tong that was where it was at, man. I'm doing a translation right now of the late Qing dynasty scholar, writer, polymath Wang Guowei. He tends almost to prefer the Song, at least when he's writing about what a poem can do.
And that's where you found this Ouyang Xiu poem. You found it in Wang Guowei's commentary on Chinese aesthetics and German philosophy, which is a weird combination.
It's one of the reasons I chose to I asked to translate it. I sent in a proposal, and Oxford University said, yes, go for it. Yeah, it's his attempt. Well, it's actually not even his attempt to reconcile it. It's him having spent a lot of years studying philosophy and then gone, you know what, though? None of this makes sense. I can't reconcile any of this. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go back to what makes sense to me, and that's literature. This is actually a neat inroad to the poem, because what grabbed me about the poem was the last line in particular. That often happens with poems. You're reading through and then something, just a turn of phrase, some line, you're like, whoa, that's interesting. What's going on here?
I think we should just read our translations of the poems. You and I both did a translation, and we're going to both put these on the website.
But I have to throw this in there. You and I are both proud intellectuals, which means we have to apologize on some level. These are rough drafts of poems. Neither of us spent like weeks working on them. This is the best we could do in a short amount of time.
This is what 差不多先生 would translate. There we go. This is 差不多先生 level.
That's it. That kind of defines us in many, many areas. But
差不多先生, just for those of y'all who don't know, is character created by Hu Shi, the late Qing early Republican essayist. 差不多 being the Chinese word for like almost, close enough.
Like man, so, yeah, close enough. That's good.
Mr. Close Enough is how that essay translates. So this is our like, Mr. Close Enough.
That's it. So I'm translating the title of this poem as Spring at Jade Tower. That's an approximation, of course. There's lots of different ways to do it. So I'm going to read mine, and then Lee's going to read his. We are drinking together and deciding on when she will return. But before we do, her face, beautiful as the spring, is marred with a sad groan. Human life, by nature, contains such moments of desperate sadness, and this pain has nothing to do with the wind or the moon. After finishing a parting song, don't repeat even a stanza, for one is enough to knot the guts. A lifetime together gazing at the flowers of Luoyang would be just enough to ease the pain at her parting.
And here's my translation. The farewell feast is like knowing firmly when you will return, the wordless woman with the face as beautiful as the spring wind first sighs with misery. In life, it is natural to have situations where one finds someone who makes you lovesick. This regret has nothing to do with either the wind nor the moon. During the farewell song, do not sing a new poem. This one song is already enough to tie one's bowels up in knots. If we were to together see every one of the Peonies of Luoyang, only then would it start to make this parting easy like the spring breeze.
So I'm going to propose we do something that translators typically don't do, and that's let's not critique the crap out of each other's translations. That tends to be the go-to mood. You're like, dude, why did you translate this word this way? This is awful. You may have noticed there are some similarities between our translations. Lee and I are not professional Song Dynasty poetry scholars, so this is close. I think it's pretty good. It's, considering that neither of us is that, our translations are not worlds apart. That's not too bad.
It's definitely 差不多先生.
It's definitely 差不多先生.
It's good. It's decent.
It's decent. Like, if I gave this to somebody who wasn't a total stickler that everything has to be translated perfectly, they'd probably say 差不多. Like, yeah, that's close enough, right?
Yeah.
So let's get into sort of why I chose the poem. So the last line is the reason I chose the poem. Both of us have some version of looking at the flowers of Luoyang, and if we looked for a long time or saw them all, that would be just about enough to ease the pain at someone's parting. What's interesting is to read that and see kind of an impossible proposition, basically saying, it would be great. So if we could just stay together forever, I think that would be just about enough to not feel sad when you leave. And this is something that Ouyang Xiu was known for, was adopting a self-deprecating kind of humorous tone in a lot of his poems, right? So when I read that, I had to read it through a few times, and I actually totally mistranslated it the first time. But even in the more or less correct, even in the 差不多先生 translation, it's still an interesting line. Did you read it that way, Lee?
I don't know if we're reading it the same way, because I don't read it all that humorously or ironically. I guess I read this entire poem in that line specifically, just entirely in a romantic, parting, sad, emotive manner. I don't see the kind of irony that you're speaking of. Can you explain that more?
Well, yeah, what I mean is, so the last line, he's basically saying to her, I know you're leaving. What would make that easier is if we could do something forever and you wouldn't leave. Or if we could do something that lasted a super long time and then you could leave. Because in your version, they're looking at all the flowers in Luoyang, which would take for freaking ever. In my version, they spend their whole lives looking at the flowers of Luoyang. One way or the other, it's a super long time. And he says, and that would make it a little easier. So if I said, Lee, it's such a bummer I have to leave. It'd be great is if you and I could just sit here and drink a beer until we're about 98.
Forever.
And then I think that would be okay then. Like that's to me, that's kind of funny, right?
Didn't I invite you to do that before you left for France?
You did. That was your last pitch. You were like, dude, I'll buy beer until we're 100. And I said, and then we'll have no livers and we'll be dead when they're 50. But
we're not going to have livers anyways. Google will have a liver for us by that point.
I think they probably will. We could download it from our Drive account.
Your G liver.
My G liver.
Liver?
That sounds like
liver?
That's it.
I can kind of see the irony that you're seeing. I don't know. It just kind of sounds like a really, really well done, sappy love song that you would hear on the radio to me.
So it does that as well. And this is one of the things I love about classical Chinese poems is there's room for both. There's room for it to be sappy, but also so well crafted. The commentary you sent me is able to find two characters here that are contrasted in different lines, and this line is with this line, and this is a natural image, and there's all this stuff working within the poem. And yet, if you wanted to, you could probably turn it into a country music song.
With any poem, when you translate it out of the original, you lose quite a bit. But I think that's even more so for Chinese, because so much of the beauty comes not from the content, which in some way is kind of formulaic. Almost. It's, like all of these parting love songs are similar. This is a genre, the parting song. So there's not anything necessarily incredible in the content, and the content is what you translate. It's entirely through the form. This character matches this character, or this character is the mirror opposite of this character, and they're in these two positions. That form, the importance of form to the aesthetic is really what I think grabs me when I go back and look at the original. It's something that I don't want to say it's impossible to translate, but it would be very difficult.
Well, it's the kind of thing that generates fist fights on, translation forums. Like the third line, there are two different characters that refer to a stanza in a zi poem, like a sort of lyric poem. They're not the same character, so they can't possibly be referring to the same thing. But how do you parse those? Because either you know enough about a zi poem to know, the que is clearly the second stanza and this is something else, or you just sort of translate the basic sense, the 差不多 version of it. and when Lee mentions that it's, dear listener, when Lee mentions that it's impossible to translate, that's part of it. So I have the word stanza in mind, okay? But there's two different characters. It's not the same character for both. So what do we do with that?
It just comes down to the impossibility of doing a quote-unquote translation, and really you're just rendering. We joked that we were doing a 差不多先生 translation, but all translations to a certain degree are 差不多先生 translations.
You can't nail it down. But what's interesting, see, this is what I do love, though, about translating this stuff. I think a professional translator would look at what both you and I did and go, wow, okay. But the content is simple enough, it's emotional enough that even if you do a not-so-great job, a lot of the impact is still going to come across. We do understand that the writer is seriously bummed out because someone is leaving. We also know, just regardless of how you translate the first line or two, that it starts happy, right? There's a festive event, they're drinking, hooray, and it doesn't end well, right?
I disagree, Rob. I don't think it starts happy. I mean, even in that first line, you've got the woman who's beautiful like the first spring wind, but she's not saying anything and she's sighing, right? Like,
right, but what comes before that, though?
Yeah, I mean, it's at a drinking party, but it's not a festive drinking party. It's a going away party.
You know, it's interesting because the commentary that you and I both read pointed out that the first part of the first line is basically the poet going, hooray, everything's awesome, you're going to be coming back soon. And then the second part of the line is her crying, which means the first part he's sort of delusional, and the second part she's proving that he's delusional. And the second full line of the poem is him sort of opining about, the thing is, everyone's life has moments like this, right? When you're so in love that you can't actually use your brain to think, and that's just how it works. And then I love that part where it says, but this has nothing to do with the wind or the moon, right? This has nothing to do with the vagaries of nature or astrology. That's just kind of a human thing. This is who we are. And I think that's one of the things I appreciate most about classical Chinese poetry is an attempt to really explain what it means to be a human being through very, very ordinary situations like this.
Yeah, I mean, the commentary that we were looking at was from Baidu Baike, which is, I think it's a good starting point. It's something that I feel comfortable disagreeing with, though. I don't take that first line as being a joyous line, but maybe I'm wrong.
You could be wrong. Either way, it's a simple poem and a complicated poem all at the same time, which I find fascinating.
And we're going to put the poem, both our translations and the original poem, on the website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. Please check it out. If you have translations that you want us to put up there, let us know. And if they're as good as ours, which shouldn't be too hard.
It's not going to be hard. Well, listen, seriously, though, I want to back this up because we've had emails from some of you out there who are translators or who are trying to translate. Give them to us. We'll put them up on the website. People can read how the rest of the community is reading this. That would be great.
Yep. Speaking of community involvement, next Friday, November 19th at 1:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, I'm going to be defending my dissertation. I just wanted to extend an offer. If anyone out there who's listening wants to join us, it's going to be a remote defense, so I'll be doing it via Zoom. I have a limited number of people who I can invite, but it's a pretty huge limit because we have Zoom accounts that have space for up to 300 people. If there are any listeners who are interested, I should be able to allow you in. If you want, send me an email, ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. I'm not going to put the Zoom invite up online, but if you are interested in seeing what an American dissertation defense in Chinese language department or a Chinese literature department looks like, join us. I think that's a good place to end it. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.